That's when there's that sigh of disappointment. We hope the talks today will live up to what the rest of the film will be, so it's always an awkward one. Thank you all for coming. I've been charged with saying welcome to the university. I'm Dr. Terry Perk. I'm the Associate Head of School here at the University of Creative Arts for Fine Art and Photography. Today's event has been kind of co-convened between us, the University of Creative Arts, and the Thames Estuary Partnership. When I say the University of Creative Arts, it assumes this kind of massive group of people who have been investing their energy in putting this event together for you, but actually it's just one of my research degree students. So one of my jobs at the university, I run the postgraduate programs within our school, and I also run the research degree program. So that's the MPhil and PhD students. I oversee all of that across our 4 campuses that we have at the university. We have one here at Rochester, we also have one in Canterbury, and we have 2 in Surrey, Epsom, Farnham. And Anna Falcini is one of my research degree students, and she's been developing some research. I'm not going to talk too much about it, she's going to talk about it a little bit later on. Thinking about the notion of atmosphere in the context of the Hoo Peninsula. It's interesting when we watch that film. It's been probably 20, 30 years since I watched that film. It's kind of great to see again. You know, we'll all end up getting out of the library now. But built into, when we're looking at that, we're looking at a landscape that is probably very familiar to a number of you. I was looking down the list of names of people's associations and stuff. But in the context of the title of today, the idea of art and the Hoo Peninsula, this kind of suggests that as artists, we might have a particular way of thinking about this thing that's geographically being defined as the Hoo Peninsula. So it's a cultural delineation. We as a society, we as a culture, say that this territory is somehow distinct in certain ways from other territories. And so then how do we go about understanding what that territory or what that area is? And implied in the title of today's set of talks is the notion that perhaps artists might be able to create a particular kind of perspective on what that landscape is and what it means. So maybe the first question we have to ask is a slightly bigger question, which is around, well, what is art? What is it that art can do that other subjects can't do? Now the notion of what art is has shifted through the centuries, but I'd argue that now, actually, one thing that art does do is it does 2 things really, in a very simple way. It asks us to look again at something that we might think is quite familiar to us. So whether you're going to the Tate Modern to see a piece of contemporary artwork, or if you're going to the local village hall to see a series of landscapes, what you're being presented with is somebody saying, hang on a second, have you seen it in this way before? And that we might, in that process of that act of looking, be able to reevaluate our sense of that place. Now, art historically, when one's thinking about it, will probably presume, well, that's actually quite a visual thing. When we think of depictions of the landscape, often they're quite representational. There is a correspondence between what we're seeing in the painting and what we see when we look out at that particular landscape. So there's that kind of correspondence. But that only gives us a certain kind of perspective. So if art is doing that, it's offering us a certain kind of perspective, we might argue, well, what other kind of perspectives could we get on the things that can't just be captured through a process of visually representing what is familiar to us? And at the heart of Anna's project, research degree project, is that question, that idea of how do I get a sense of this place that's very familiar to me through means that might not just be purely representational, that might be a narrative or a story that happens through that place, that might be something that's felt on the surface of the skin, rather than necessarily just seen with one's eyes. We look at the speakers today, a number of them are artists, but there's a couple that aren't. And But the people who aren't artists are going to be talking about creating a particular kind of view of that landscape. And in doing that, we're essentially saying we can't quite say what that landscape is. By bringing all these people together, by them each presenting the landscape in different ways, we're saying actually it's multiple, the perspectives that we can have on this space. Actually, we're kind of grasping at it. We might momentarily get a sense of it, and then we might have to reevaluate our view on that. Because the nature of that place is defined not just by what we see, but by economies. Economies that are actually very real monetary economies, but also might be economies of movement through that space. It might be an economy of the wildlife that shifts and changes, that appears and disappears. The shifting territories, the way in which that's used as an industry. Okay? All those things together, this kind of network of forces that are shifting and changing, get a sense of what that place is. So the question is, how do we as artists try to capture some of those things that aren't always visual in that space? Sometimes through visual means, but also sometimes not through visual means. That's me talking enough before I get to full lecture mode. I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to introduce the speakers today. I'm going to disappear into the wings. Did you want to say something, Pat?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few words about what the Thames Estuary Partnership is, because this is sort of a new venture for us. And it came to me because she said, oh, I'm looking at the Who, and do you have any materials? And then we started talking about what she was doing, all of that. Now, the Thames Estuary Partnership is a charity that's 20 years old. What we do is we bring together everybody who has an interest in or an impact on the Thames. And we try to, we're aiming for a sustainable management of the Thames, and that's about bringing everyone together who somehow has some way to impact that. And so when Anna came, it's interesting what you're saying about non-visual. What I'm doing is I'm using you shamelessly because people come to the Thames through all different ways. They get an interest in it, they're excited about it, they care about it, not just through engineering. Historically, we've done a lot of engineering. RSPB is here. Through wildlife, you know, it's understood that people actually engage in different ways, and so through art, we get to a new network, a new community who help us to get people to look at the Thames and to care about the Thames in whatever way they choose to care about the Thames. So that's why I am doing this with Anna, and Anna has loads of more ideas, and I hope we're going to be doing a lot together. The reason I'm holding this up is that this is our quarterly magazine. And what I always ask people to do is, will you write an article for us? Because this is determined by what you do. And if you don't do anything, we do it. So I'd rather have you say, I want to write something about art and the Who, and then we get it out. And we're looking at bringing an academic conference on, I hope September 2017, don't hold me to that, about art and the environment. So we want to really build on this aspect of our work, which really we haven't done for our 20 years. So thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Has everybody got the
So thank you to Terry and Pat for those wonderful introductions. I just want to say a few words before we kick off with our first speaker. I think artists are sort of attracted to all kinds of landscapes for different reasons, but Hoo Peninsula has been for a long time, I think, a source of inspiration, both historically and in contemporary ways. I think that shorelines have been like perfect places to observe the maritime seas depicted by painters such as Turner. And it's provided the textures and scenes for writers like Dickens and Pepys, and more recently for people like Ian Sinclair, Peter Ackroyd and myself. For me, it's like the perfect place for perambulating, for getting lost, for waiting for the right atmosphere, for uncovering absent life in old-military buildings. Contemporary art is continuing to explore its big skies, its mud creeks and salt marshes. Artists like Jananda Speedwell, Frank Watson, Michael Collins, Adam Todd Stoughton, Nietzsche, Stephen Turner, Andrew Cotting, Theo Barnard and Bronwyn Buckridge, just amongst many artists who are a good story here. And it seems to me that in general terms there's a kind of renewed surge of interest in and it's just kind of gaining and increasing momentum. Quite why that's happening, I'm not totally sure, but I think maybe the attention that is kind of gained from events like the recent Coast Airport have brought some sort of notice to this place from outside of the region. I think, of course, those who live in it or near it have known about its unique qualities, and I've been really privileged to meet a number of really lovely people who are sort of involved in those communities and, you know, who've lived, been born in those communities. And those people have really been collecting and documenting lots of really wonderful material for many years, and they continue to do that. They've also been looking after that environment, which is so critical. I think we're extremely fortunate that there is such a wealth of preserved materials, and that at various times groups and individuals have defended that landscape and fought for its preservation. So I'd just really like to welcome you all today to this event. Thank you very much for coming. It's really lovely to see you all here today. I'd like to thank our speakers, Ed, Jananda and Michael, for so generously giving up their time today and for sharing their experiences with us. Charlie is our other speaker who's not able to be here today, but will be showing his film. I'd also really like to thank UCA for hosting the event and providing refreshments. And I'd like to thank Terry for introducing the event today and for all his support. And also I'd really like to thank Pat and her team at Estuary Thames Partnership, Thames Estuary Partnership for their support. Our first speaker. So we've got Ed Carpenter, who's going to talk on the first presentation. Ed is an archaeologist working in historic England, and that's the public body that looks after England's historic environment. He's a member of the area survey team, and was introduced to when working on a project that explores England landscape from prehistory to modern periods. His impressions of Hoo are primarily via the many historic aerial photographs taken of the peninsula from wide and versus onwards. He has a particular interest in the way the landscape is perceived, and is intrigued by the varying at times contradictory ways that this peninsula has been viewed over time. And I've been privileged to sort of work a little bit with Ed, and just he showed me sort of some of the aerial photographs, and it's really fascinating. And if you do get an opportunity, the Historic England report on Hoo Peninsula is absolutely fantastic, and it's really, really extensive. So, thank you to Ed.
Looking after the historic environment. So I'm going to start with a bit of background. I appreciate that there's a subtitle, Historic Perceptions of Hoo, because that's really what we're going to be looking at today. But for a bit of background, I work in the area survey team and I was involved in a project that was undertaken by Historic England, when we were then called English Heritage. In 2009 it started. So there was lots of disciplines, people going out to the field, looking at the earthwork remains, architectural stories, looking at some of the buildings, and my aim, I was one of the team, was looking at the aerial photos. So I'm not going to go into detail about the work we do, but this is a slide of, as you can see, the Hoo Peninsula, black and white ordnance survey based on that. Everything you can see in colour are features identified on aerial photographs that have been mapped as part of the project. And so you might see a range of features. So anything that comes out red will be earthwork banks, for example, the purple colours are structures. So we build up a picture of the Hoo Peninsula based on what you can see on air photos. Somewhat similar to this. So this is a 1944. This is a 1944 RAF photograph of the Hoo Peninsula. And in terms of the photos we work with, this is amazingly useful to work with because it's such small scale. But I love this photograph. It gets pretty much the whole peninsula in. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with this landscape. At the top left we have Essex, with the Thames running through the northern end of the peninsula. We can just see a little bit of the Medway coming around here and joining with the Thames up there. So grey top right. So Hoo is quite a varied landscape, and this photo gives you an impression of the variety of the landscape. That higher London clay kind of ridge that runs along the peninsula is where the fields are, so you get these light and dark patchworks of fields. This is where the people have created their fields, and then this is fringed by the marshes. So you've got cliff, cooling marshes in the north, grey at the very end, and Stoke Saltings and so on. So there's that variety of landscape type, because within there you've got large and small villages, and you've got industrial sites and remnants of defensive sites. So that was a variety of landscape qualities of something that appealed to historic England for this project. The other thing that drew us to Hoo was it's a landscape that's seen a lot of development and the potential for more development. When the project was underway, the airport was a very real proposal. I think that's in abeyance now, but there was a proposal for an airport in Hoo in about 1945. So sometimes you feel there's a cyclical nature to some of these development pressures. So it's a landscape that you could say is under threat in terms of development. It would be good to know more about and how the historic environment has shaped it. And another thing with the perceptions is to challenge perceptions of a landscape like Hoo. So for some non-residents who may be perceived as ordinary, lacking in value or scarred by industry, but one of the things we're interested in is what makes a place special, and what is interesting is not just the cathedrals and palaces and so on. There are different elements of landscape that make it the place that it is and special to people. So my focus is going to be on perception, and I'm going to look at some of the different ways that Hoo's been perceived over time. So as with any other part of the country, it can be seen in different ways, and these different perceptions reflect the individuals who are having these thoughts about a place. What aspects of the landscape are they considering when they form their views on the landscape? And many, including me, aren't from the landscape in question, and so they're coming as outsiders to a landscape and their ideas. So many of the descriptions we have of Hoo, going back to the 16th century through to the 21st century, and these may be fiction or non-fiction, but they do tend to focus on the marshes, and they use words such as uninhabited, eerie, desolation, wilderness, and when they describe the peninsula. And so they often perceive Hoo in melancholic terms. And then these terms are introduced or reinforced to the people who are reading these books. So I'm going to group some of these perceptions under different headings. So we're going to start with sickness and sorrow. And this is a view of cliff and cooling marshes. So the Thames on the left, Cliff Fleet winding its way toward the Thames. This photo taken in January 2010 by one of the archaeologists in our department who does reconnaissance flights from a light aircraft. So these accounts from the 16th century onwards sometimes describe Hoo as unpleasant and unhealthy. Hoo is described as unwholesome, both by William Lambard in a 1570 book that he published called The Perambulation of Kent, and also by William Camden in his 1607 book Britannia. William Lambard even incorrectly claimed the name Hoo derives from the Old English word for sickness or sorrow. So this idea that this is not a very nice place is affecting how they think that the derivation of the word was created. So fever, ague or ague, and fever. So this period was also when malaria became established on the peninsula. The disease and the role mosquitoes played in transmitting the disease wasn't properly understood at the time, but a link was made between the illness and what was perceived as the unhealthy nature of the marshes. So malaria at the time went by a number of different names, but it was also known as marsh fever. I think that's another example where this name clearly links disease to the landscape itself. And here you've got 3 air photos. So this is of Hoo Island. So this is just south of Hoo-Peninsula. The black and white photos were taken in 1947 by the RAF. We've got millions of RAF photos, generally starting around the war, just after the war, and particularly just after the war, the RAF did a comprehensive cover of vertical photographs. That is, the photographs are mounted at the bottom of the plane facing straight down to create complete coverage of the country in the years immediately after the Second World War. So this shows Hoo Island in the Medway. But the reason I'm bringing that now is that during the early years of the 18th century, he was chosen as a place for quarantine. There were two plague outbreaks in the early 1700s, and the Baltic crisis, the Marseille crisis, and it was decided by the Privy Council that quarantined ships to quarantined initially in the north, but then eventually it was decided they were going to be quarantined in Stangate Creek, then made way just south of Hoo Peninsula. And then with the second crisis, goods were taken off the ships and they were aired on Hoo Island. And we don't know for sure, but the speculation is that this is before Hoo Fort, for any of you who know this area. And it's this circular earthwork here, which I've shown in more detail there. So we've got a circular earthwork at the northwestern corner, northeastern corner of Hoo Island. And it's speculated this may define the area grounds that were created in the 1720s. And then the bottom right, I've just used a modern Google Earth photo at high tide just to show some of the earthwork plots you've got. So in the 1940s, you can trace the entire circuit of that earthwork, albeit at high tide now. Most of that north and northeastern element of that has now disappeared. So we've had illness, but now to fat in the salt marshes, and this is really to well, I think I'll start just describe this photo quickly. We're looking east along Hoo, and you may all be able to see Grain Power Station at the end there, and this area here, Stoke Saltings, are very broken up. It's a high tide or near high tide, you've got a very broken up rough grassland within Stoke Saltings. So we talked about illness and how unhealthy it was and perceived to be. But paradoxically, although they're considered unhealthy for people, these were considered salt marshes as brilliant areas for animals. This is a good area to fatten up livestock, and you've got accounts from at least the early 17th century talking about how beneficial it is for livestock to be grazing on the salt marshes. In particular, sheep in the marshes were said never to suffer from the disease known as sheep rot, and some claims were made that salt from the marshes could cure sick animals. As recently as the 1870s, it was claimed that lame or ill horses had frequently been restored to health after a few months on the marshes, and especially on the saltings. So you've got, again, at the same period of time, it was conflict, very unhealthy for people, very beneficial to animals. So I've just highlighted Stoke Saltings as it is today. Here's a ground shot. So this is from the east looking west, we're looking back to Kingsnorth Power Station. This was taken last year, I think, this photograph. But again, you can see how fragmented the saltings now are, salt marshes. And this is an 1870 map of Stoke Saltings. The photo we've just seen, probably I think the photographer is possibly here, looking this way. I hope you can see that in the 1870s, Stoke Saltings was an extensive area of rough grassland with subdivided by creeks, but not that fragmented landscape we see today. As a quick aside, for those who aren't aware, the change to this landscape was because of the cement manufacture that took place in the Thames and Medway region from the late 19th century. This area became the centre of Portland cement manufacture in Britain, and one of the reasons was the clay that could be dug from here was seen to be so good in making Portland cement. And so areas like Stoke Salting or all the mudflat areas around Hoo Island we just saw were dug away and the clay taken off to the cement works further upstream. But what we see on some of the photos that I've picked out here on the 19th century map is that on this area of saltings that was all dug away, or largely dug away, there are a series of raised causeways which I've marked out in blue, allowing access across the saltings. And some of these lead up to small livestock enclosures which I've outlined in red. So these are earthwork banks defining livestock enclosures. So a rough landscape, rough grazing, was actually an important resource for the people who lived and worked here. And this is, I probably should have pointed out, one of those enclosures I picked out in red in the previous slide still survives. So you've got this livestock enclosure here, the remnants of the causeway coming down. So that would have been largely within grazing when constructed. Now, towards low tide, but it's sitting essentially on those plans. Feel free to see. This 16th century proverb, which you may or may not be familiar with, doesn't put Hoo in a very good light. It's dirty and it's for the criminals, or there are criminals present. And so, sailors were, I'm not sure how accurate it is, sailors were certainly the victims of crime, and there are accounts of sailors coming from Chatham after being paid, being robbed at Gad's Hill, which is in the southwestern of the peninsula. As another aside, Gad's Hill is where the Home and Nevinson, after a robbery, then did a dramatic horse ride to York in one day. Later, this was attributed to anyway, so there's a good link to that story. So yes, there are thefts certainly at Gad's Hill. There are a lot of stories to do with smuggling on Hoo. They've been, the little I've looked at, it's been difficult to verify some of the stories, but it was a real problem, and there were so-called riding officers were appointed who would patrol Hoo in the 18th century. So smuggling in particular seems to be a problem. And as we saw in the clip of the film at the start, aspects of criminality and the hidden nature of Hoo, famously used by Dickens in Great Expectations, when these marshes provided a place escaped convicts could hide. And I think Dickens' fictional episode has some parallels with this, and probably similar accounts of convict escape. So this was reported in the Kentish Gazette, October 1810. On Friday last, 7 convicts took the Zealand Holt boat at Sheerness, so that's a prison hold, and made for the Isle of Grain. They were pursued, and 4 were retaken. 1 was drowned and attempted to cross a fleet, and the other 2 made their escape. And in my initial research, I haven't found any follow-up story accounts in the newspapers, so we can maybe suspect those other 2 did get away with it. So we now look at the Stranger's View. So this is a reproduction or a recreation of a title sheet, so of an account of a journey by the botanist Thomas Johnson. So in July 1629, Thomas Johnson was one of a group of 10 people, botanists, who landed in the Isle of Grain East End of the Hudson. Now his account of his visit in 1629 wasn't positive. There's a few quotes here. So he begins by stating that they walked 5 or 6 miles without saying a single thing that gives any pleasure. And Grain's not very big, so already I'm thinking 5 or 6 miles they've been winding around. They were thirsty, but the water was brackish. They were equally afflicted with hunger in that inhuman wilderness, where there was no town within easy reach, no smoke to be seen, no barking of dogs to be heard. They eventually made their way to Stoke for dinner. Johnson and one of his colleagues decided to continue on to cooling, but the other 8 had enough. And they hitched a ride on a brewer's dray, where Johnson left them, I quote, lolling among the barrels. So, this is a map from 1716, so maybe 18 was 90 years after Johnson, Dr. Thomas Johnson visited Grain, but this is part of Grain. It confounds the conventions that we understand from maps, so the Thames is at the bottom, so essentially there's a guide here, but essentially we've got the Thames, and then running south from the Thames is Yamlet Creek. So it's just a little part of Grain. You can see this is a landscape that's subdivided by these natural creeks, and then some of the straighter drainage ditches as well, which combine together to make a very enclosed landscape. So what I think about when you think about what Dr. Johnson's saying, you think that maybe this is an outsider's unfamiliarity with the landscape, and that it can adversely affect your perception of it. He was unable to easily navigate his way around this landscape. And I think one of the frustrations probably with a landscape like this is it's a landscape that offers wide, open, uninterrupted views. You can see where you want to go, but on the ground, the route you take isn't obvious. Dickens makes this point in Great Expectations. Now I know this is fiction, but again, it's an area he knew. He's talking about the place, and if people get their experience of Hoo from the work of fiction, that's still their opinion based.